Hello everyone, I'm Zhang from Penn State. Today I'm presenting the paper Toxicity by Game Design. Toxicity is an umbrella term for various forms of negative behaviors exhibited by players in online environment. For example, harassment, flaming, and trolling are all forms of toxicity. Toxicity can also negatively impact players and especially victims' emotions such as bringing them depression and anxiety. Researchers in CHIPLAY community actively discuss the cause of toxicity in games, and there are indeed many reasons. For example, players with aggressive personalities are likely to conduct toxicity, and players with low self-efficacy may easily become victims of it. Social dynamics in multiplayer games such as resource conflicts or failures of meeting expected responsibilities can lead to toxicity as well. Culture in a country where players act, such as individualism, and culture in games such as normalization of toxicity can also influence toxicity of individual players as well. Lastly, certain game designs can increase the likelihood of toxic behavior. For instance, players using characters with high kills are more likely to be toxic, and in games with sexualized characters, sexual harassment is more likely to occur. Researchers are also actively seeking and discussing ways to improve game designs to better mitigate toxicity. However, unlike other factors where there are overarching themes or theories that summarize the cause of toxicity, not much research has investigated an overarching game design pattern that can show how game design influences toxicity. In addition, there is very little research to show how players think about how design can influence toxicity in a good or bad way. Therefore, to fill the research gap, this paper wants to understand how the players perceive the influence of game design on toxicity. In order to answer the research question, we conducted an interview study with participants who have experienced toxicity in online games. We interviewed 20 participants who reported their experiences with toxicity in 29 online games. We then conducted a reflective thematic analysis to identify patterns on how game design influences toxicity. We found 4 game design patterns that can cause toxicity. Next, I will explain each of them with one quote. The first game design pattern that can influence toxicity is team interdependency, which means the extent to which players must rely on their teammates in order to advance or succeed in game. For example, one participant shared a toxic experience in the game League of Legends involving the jungler role who stay in the green areas for most of the time but also responsible for actively supporting other players in 3 lines through an action known as ganking. In this instance, the participant mentioned that they would call the jungler role during the game for additional support. However, the jungler responded that they need to help players in other lines as well, and this conversation would often escalate to toxicity. The toxicity, while seemingly a result of junglers' in-game decision-making, actually stemmed from the decision of the jungler role. This role requires significantly more collaboration with all other teammates. Therefore, the imbalance of the workload for jungler role creates a heavier burden on jungler, and in a game with such role designs, toxicity is more likely to occur around the player in this role. The second design pattern that can influence toxicity is fairness, which means that the extent to which a game design can provide every player with an equal chance to compete and enjoy the game. For example, in some open world game like World of Warcraft, players can go certain areas to gain resources or level up. Currently, World of Warcraft have level range for different areas, as you can see in this picture. However, as the participant said previously in World of Warcraft, some areas allow all level players to enter and get resources. This would result in high-level players engaging in toxic behavior by entering low-level areas to monopolize resources, taking advantage of their high-level status. This behavior creates an unfair situation for low-level players since it leaves them resources and is considered toxic. This toxicity stemming from high-level players is actually a result of game encounter design, which creates an unfair situation for low-level players. The third design pattern is interaction design, which means a design that suggests how player can use it to act in a multiplayer game and thus influence their fellow players' in-game experiences. For example, a participant shared a toxic experience in League of Legends involving a player who kept dancing in the game with loud music. I'm going to play a short video here to show you how disturbing this could be.
You ready?
Dancing in League of Legends is meant to add humor and create lighthearted interaction in an intense competitive game. However, as you can see, some dances come with loud music, and if played repeatedly, they can be perceived as annoying and toxic. The last design pattern is privacy, which refers to one's ability to control personal information about oneself for what information can be seen by others in which way. For example, in games with the voice channel, I had a few female participants reported that revealing their genders through the voice channel leads to unwanted flirting and even sexual harassment from other players. Although voice channel is intended for communication, it exposes gender information unwantedly. So far, I have introduced the game design pattern that can cause toxicity. For toxicity to occur in game, 3 elements are needed: a toxic perpetrator who initiates the toxic behavior, a victim who is the target, and the interaction between the perpetrator and the victim, which we call toxic behavior. Our study found that game design patterns can influence these 3 factors affecting toxicity. First, game design can trigger toxic conduct. For example, we discussed how jungler role can create collaboration burden to the player. The role design can trigger toxicity if the player fails to meet teammates' expectation in collaboration. Once this trigger is formed, a player may be motivated to conduct toxicity in the game. Game design can also influence vulnerability, making some players more susceptible to become victims of toxic conduct. For instance, low-level players in the same area with high-level players can be vulnerable since they can only suffer the consequences of what higher-level players can do. Similarly, voice channel can expose players' gender, making female players become a target because of their identity. Next, game design can influence interaction between perpetrator and victims. We found that players often use game design elements in unintended ways, a concept known as design affordance. This represents an interpretive relationship between the user and the design. For example, while a design emote might be intended for humor, player might use it to annoy others. When design can be used negatively, toxic perpetrators can exploit it to target victims. Lastly, I want to clarify that it is not entirely the game design's fault that toxicity occurs. Game design can influence someone to become a toxic perpetrator or a victim, or to use the design in a toxic manner. These influences are often unintended consequences of game design, where the design affects people in ways the designer did not anticipate. The good news is that our paper identified design patterns which can lead to these unintended consequences. We also propose ways to mitigate toxicity based on this framework. For more details, please refer to our paper. Moving forward, it is crucial for game designers to access the potential impact of these game design patterns on toxicity. Future research can further explore different methodology and stakeholders' views to understand how game design influences toxicity in different games. Thank you so much for your attention.